They said the house was built on fortune, but to him it felt like a tomb wrapped in marble and gold. New York, 1835, and the grand estate rose from the frozen ground like a coffin dressed in wealth. Its tall windows glared out over the city as though it meant to watch and never blink, its brick walls heavy with silence. Snow lay along the streets outside, but within the house the fire never dimmed, and the smell of burning would curl through every corridor. To the Masters, this warmth was comfort. To him, it was suffocation. He lived in its heat like an ember trapped in a forge, waiting for the air that would let him burn. His bare feet carried him soundlessly across the polished floors, every step swallowed by the marble. He was young, though hunger had carved hollows into his cheeks and left his frame leaner than his years should allow. He carried trays, washed clothes, polished glass until it glimmered like ice in the light of the chandeliers. He did these things without a word, head bowed, eyes lowered, moving as though he were less than shadow. For in the house of the Masters, silence was not only expected, it was demanded. A silence broken only by the crack of leather, or the hard slap of a hand against skin, or the laughter that followed cruelty as though it were a game. The whip scars across his back never healed fully. They glowed faintly when the firelight struck them, like pale rivers across dark soil. He had learned to endure them as one learns to live with winter. You cannot fight it, so you survive it. His silence was not submission, it was a mask. Behind lowered eyes, he carried the weight of every insult, every kick, every night of cold hunger. And deep inside, buried where no master could see, smoldered something far older than fear. It was not rebellion yet, not hope, not even hatred. It was fire, a fire that had no name, a fire that waited. The big house was full of voices, but none that spoke to him. Masters spoke with ease, their words sharp with authority, dripping with a kind of casual venom that seemed part of their very breath. The children echoed their parents, mocking, laughing, ordering him about as if it were a game. Even the visitors, merchants and gentlemen from the city, carried themselves with the same cruel indifference. To them, he was invisible, an object to be summoned, dismissed, punished, ignored. But in invisibility, he learned to see what others could not. He learned the rhythms of their laughter, the way their voices rose when greed was near, the subtle flicker of fear when money was spoken of in low tones. He learned who drank more than they should, who lingered too long at the table, who left secrets open on their desks after midnight. The house thought him blind, but he saw more than any of them dared. At night, when the halls fell quiet and the candles guttered into smoke, he would lie awake on the rough boards of his quarters. The cold crept through the cracks in the walls, and he listened to the silence. In the silence he heard the voices of the past. His mother's lullaby, broken by the cry of chains, the sound of waves crashing against the hold of a ship, the echo of men groaning in darkness. He carried those voices like scars no eye could see, and when he closed his eyes, he saw the house itself not as it was but as it truly lived. A carcass dressed in velvet, dripping with decay, hiding its rot with perfume and firelight. He knew it was alive in its own way, and like all living things, it could be killed. The Masters believed themselves untouchable. Their wealth, their friends in the city, their walls of brick and iron, these were their armor. But the young man knew the truth. Armor is strongest against the blade you can see. But what of the blade you cannot? What of the quiet hand, the shadow in the corner, the silence in the hall? Even the mightiest fortress cannot guard against silence. And silence was what he had mastered. Still, he showed no hint of what lay within him. By day he bowed, carried, polished, obeyed. When the Master's cane struck his shoulder for the crime of moving too slowly, he did not flinch. When the mistress cursed his clumsy hands for spilling a drop of wine, he bowed lower. He made himself smaller than breath, lighter than ash, until they forgot he was there at all. This was his greatest shield, their blindness. They saw only what they wished, a slave, silent, broken, beneath them. They never saw the ember that glowed behind his eyes. One evening, as the wind outside rattled against the shutters and the snow fell heavier than before, He was called to the parlor. The masters lounged in velvet chairs, their boots stretched toward the fire. A guest had come, a wealthy man from the harbor, his voice thick with drink, his words dripping disdain. They spoke of trade, of ships, of profits that seemed endless. But when the conversation turned to people, to lives, they laughed. They laughed as they spoke of sales, of bodies weighed and priced, of families torn apart as casually as one might divide bread. Their laughter filled the room, rich and cruel, echoing against the walls until it seemed the house itself was mocking him. He bowed, served the wine, and left without a word. But in his chest the fire stirred. The laughter would not leave him. It clung to him as he moved down the hall, as he returned to the kitchen, as he sat in silence long after the night had grown old. It echoed until it became something else. Not just memory but fuel. And though he could not name it yet, though he could not see its shape, the ember inside him grew hotter. The house did not notice. The masters did not notice. No one noticed, and that was their first mistake. The kitchen was a world apart from the glittering halls above, but it was no less a prison. Stone walls sweated with damp, iron pots hung heavy from hooks, and the fire roared in the hearth with a hunger that seemed endless. The smell of bread, broth, and meat filled the air, but to him those smells were never nourishment. They were chains disguised as comfort, a reminder that his labor fed others while his own stomach gnawed itself in silence. The masters dined on abundance. He survived on scraps, crusts, the forgotten edges of their feast. Here, in the bowels of the house, time was measured not by clocks but by commands. When the bell rang, when the mistress's voice cut the air like a knife, when the boots of the master struck the stairs and silence was required at once. The kitchen was his kingdom only in the sense that he knew every corner of it, every blade, every jar of spice, every crack in the stone floor where spilled wine had left stains that never fully faded. But a kingdom is no blessing when you are its prisoner. It was in this place of heat and hunger that the whispers always found him. They were not whispers meant for his ears, but the careless words of those who believed him deaf to meaning. They spoke freely in his presence because to them he was furniture, a shadow with hands. He cleaned while they joked of money, while they spoke of auctions, while they discussed shipments of bodies as if they were shipments of wood or cloth. He heard the mistress complain that her newest gown cost more than 3 strong men. He heard the master boast that he would sell a boy down south for twice the price because the city has softened him. Each word was a blade. Each laugh was a whip. But he endured, polishing silver with hands that did not tremble, stirring pots with arms that carried their pain like stone. He endured, but he also remembered. The kitchen, filled with smoke and whispers, became the place where cruelty grew roots in his chest. For cruelty is louder when it hides behind laughter, and cruelty repeated becomes unbearable. One night, as he scrubbed the long wooden table, he overheard something that did not fade. The master had brought a guest down to drink by the fire, their voices thick with wine. They spoke of a woman, sold not far from here, whose child had been taken and shipped away. The guest laughed, saying, "They wail like wolves when their young are stolen, but wolves can be tamed. Break the spirit and the body follows." They laughed, long and loud, while the young man stood at the edge of the firelight, cloth in hand, scrubbing, 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 until his knuckles bled. That night he did not sleep. He lay awake in his narrow cot, the cold pressing into his bones, and he thought of the wolves. He thought of his own mother's cry, long ago, when chains closed around her wrists. He thought of the sea, the endless dark of it, and the way men had wailed in its belly. Wolves, they had called them, but he knew wolves did not forget. Wolves watched, waited, and when the time came, wolves bit deep. It was then the dream began to take shape. Not a dream of freedom. He was not naive enough to think the chains could be broken by hope alone. Not a dream of escape. The city outside the walls was another prison, lined with strangers who would hunt him down. No, his dream was smaller, sharper, quieter. It was a dream born not of the lash but of the kitchen itself. The jars on the shelves, the herbs that gave flavor to soups, the powders that could heal or harm. He had seen them all. He had handled them all. And he knew enough to know that not all powders gave life. Some took it away. The idea came like a whisper, softer than the hiss of boiling broth. What if silence could be turned against them? What if the same invisibility that made him nothing in their eyes could become his greatest weapon? No fire, no sword, no open rebellion. Just patience. Just a hand, steady and quiet, moving in the right moment. The thought terrified him at first. To even imagine it felt like sin. But sin is nothing compared to chains. Sin is nothing compared to the laughter of men who buy and sell the lives of children. The thought grew. It returned each night as he lay awake, stronger each time, until it no longer frightened him, steadied him. It gave him something the masters had never allowed him before: choice. He began to watch more carefully. He noticed which dishes the masters favored, which cups they reached for, which wines they drank most greedily. He studied their habits as one studies the turning of seasons. He saw that the master always demanded the first slice of meat, that the mistress always lifted her glass high when guests were present, that the children were careless, spilling food but never wine. He learned where the powders were kept, and he learned how the kitchen girls handled them without thought, tossing pinches into pots, never aware of the difference between a seasoning and a sentence. The fire in his chest smoldered hotter now, fed by every laugh, every command, every careless word. He did not show it. He bowed lower, moved more swiftly, smiled when required. His silence deepened, but behind it the plan sharpened. He began to imagine the night itself, the hall glowing with candlelight, the masters drunk on their own power, the silver trays gleaming as they were carried in. He saw their hands lift the goblets, their lips touch the rim, their throats swallow. He saw their laughter change into coughing, into gasps, into silence. The image was almost too much to bear. It filled him with a strange kind of calm. Not joy, not triumph, but calm. As if for the first time in his life, the weight pressing down upon him might one day lift. Not fully, not forever, but long enough to breathe. Above him, the house continued to feast, to laugh, to drink. Below, in the smoke of the kitchen, he carried the secret seed of vengeance. It was fragile, invisible, but alive. And as he wiped his bloodied knuckles on the rag, staring into the fire, he whispered to himself words no master would ever hear. Every feast has its ending. The winter night came heavy with silence, the kind of silence that presses against windows and seeps beneath doors. Snow fell thick upon the city, blanketing the streets until even the sound of wheels and hooves seemed distant, muffled, forgotten. Inside the big house, however, there was no silence. The dining hall blazed with light, every chandelier dripping gold, every candle flickering like a star fallen from the sky. Laughter clattered against the walls, loud and careless, echoing down the corridors. The air was warm with the smell of roasted meat, buttered bread, and rich wine. They gathered in their velvet and silks, the masters of the house and their guests, men of wealth and reputation. They raised their glasses high, their faces flushed with wine and pride, speaking of trade, of ships, of fortunes yet to be made. Their voices were the music of arrogance, filling the hall until even the paintings on the walls seemed to sneer. And through it all, he moved among them like a shadow. His hands carried the silver trays, his steps soundless upon the polished floor. He bowed when called, stepped back when dismissed, his eyes lowered. To them, he was no more than the servants who stoked the fire or cleared the dishes. But to him, the night was something else entirely. It was not a feast. It was a reckoning. For in the kitchen earlier, his hands had worked with a stillness that belied the storm inside him. The meat had been brushed with more than herbs. The wine had been touched with more than sweetness. A powder, fine as ash, bitter as sorrow, had disappeared into the food and drink. He had moved with the same silence he always carried, the silence they mistook for obedience. They did not notice. They never noticed. Now, as he moved through the hall, the silver platters gleamed in the candlelight like instruments of fate. Each dish placed before them was no longer sustenance but sentence. Each goblet a silent verdict. He carried history in his hands, the groans of ships, the cries of mothers, the scars across his back. All of it balanced on the edge of a single night. The masters lifted their knives, carving into the roasted flesh with laughter that rose like thunder. They poured wine until it spilled over the rims of their goblets, red as blood, staining the cloth. Their children laughed, chasing each other beneath the table, unaware of the shadow that loomed above them. The guests toasted greed, toasted cruelty, toasted their own invincibility. And all the while he watched. His hands trembled when he set down the final tray, but not with fear. They trembled with weight, the weight of generations, the weight of silence, the weight of a fire that had burned too long in the dark. He knew what he had done. He knew what was to come. And still, he moved quietly to the corner of the hall, folding his hands behind his back, lowering his gaze, as though nothing in the world had changed. But everything had changed. The minutes stretched long, heavy as iron. The sound of forks against plates, the ring of glass, the peal of laughter. It all filled the air until it seemed unbearable. He could hear the crackle of the fire in the great hearth, see the flames reflected in their jeweled eyes. He waited. Patience had been beaten into him from birth, and now it was his weapon. The first to falter was the guest from the harbor, a broad man with a voice like a drum. His laughter cut short into a cough. He pressed a hand to his throat, reaching for his goblet as though more wine might soothe him. But the wine only deepened his choking. His face flushed red, then pale, his eyes widening with confusion. At first, no one noticed. The others were too busy with their feasting, their boasting, their endless noise. Then the mistress set down her fork. She blinked once, slowly, as though the candlelight had suddenly grown too bright. Her hand trembled as she lifted her glass, spilling dark red across the white tablecloth. She drank, but the trembling grew worse. Her lips pressed together, her eyes narrowing with a dawning fear she could not name. The children stopped their games, staring at their mother's strange stillness. The master barked at them to sit, his voice harsh, but even as he spoke his hand shook against the knife. He forced another bite into his mouth, as though to prove nothing was wrong, but his jaw worked slower now, his breath heavier. One by one, the hall began to falter. Laughter died into silence. Voices cracked into coughs. Glasses spilled across the table, the red wine spreading like blood across linen. Eyes widened, throats clutched, breaths struggled. The music of arrogance became the dirge of fear. From his corner he did not move. His face remained calm, his body still, but inside him every heartbeat struck like a drum. He felt no triumph, no glee, only stillness. For vengeance is not joy, it is silence. Silence where once there was laughter. Silence where once there was cruelty. The chandeliers above flickered as though the house itself sensed what was happening, its gold trappings unable to hide the truth. The big house, the coffin dressed in wealth, was becoming a tomb before his eyes. And he, the invisible one, the shadow they had never seen, was the only witness. The fire in the hearth roared higher, its flames dancing as if to celebrate. But he did not celebrate. He simply watched, his trembling hands clasped together now, steady at last. For the night was not theirs anymore. The night belonged to silence. And the silence had only just begun. The laughter that had filled the hall only hours before had curdled into something unrecognizable. Now it was coughing, gasping, groaning. A symphony of ruin echoing beneath gilded ceilings. The chandeliers still blazed with light, but that light no longer glittered. It exposed. It revealed faces pale with sickness, hands clawing at throats, eyes wide with terror. The grand dining hall, once a temple of arrogance, had become a chamber of reckoning. The mistress was the first to fall. Her silks tangled beneath her as she crumpled, fingers clutching at the tablecloth, dragging goblets and plates crashing to the floor. Red wine bled into the wood, dripping like blood onto the polished marble below. Her children screamed, their cries high and thin, their small hands reaching for her as if their touch might return the breath already leaving her body. The master rose, his chair clattering backward, his cane striking the floor. His voice boomed in fury, but the sound cracked mid-syllable, breaking into a cough that tore through him. He staggered, his heavy frame trembling, his face twisted between disbelief and fear. The guests, those men of trade and wealth, fared no better. Their boasts were gone, replaced by the raw sound of survival, the desperate wheeze of air refusing to come, the thud of knees hitting stone. Some clawed at the food as though searching for the culprit within it, as though tearing apart the meat might undo what had already been swallowed. Others reached for their cups, their trembling hands spilling crimson across their sleeves. All of them, one by one, collapsed into the silence they had once mocked. The chandeliers swayed gently as if the house itself groaned beneath the weight of its dying masters. He watched the mistress twitch once, twice, then lie still. He watched the master stagger toward him, cane clutched like a weapon, his lips shaping words that never left his mouth. The man's eyes burned with fury, then with desperation, then with nothing at all as he collapsed only feet away. The cane rolled across the floor and struck the boy's ankle, but he did not move. The children's cries cut through him deeper than any lash had ever done. They screamed for their mother, for their father, for a mercy that would not come. Their small bodies trembled, their faces wet with tears. They had been born into cruelty, raised on its milk, but they were still children. For a moment the fire inside him wavered. He had not planned for their voices. He had not planned for innocence caught in the wake of vengeance. His hands clenched, his breath shallow. But the silence he carried was stronger. He did not move to help them. He did not move at all. The hours stretched. The feast rotted before his eyes, untouched plates congealing into decay. The guests slumped in their chairs or sprawled upon the floor, jewels glimmering uselessly against lifeless skin. The hall grew colder as the fire burned lower, its roar dwindling into crackles, its heat fading into shadows. The only sounds left were the sobs of the children and the faint rattle of dying breaths, each one weaker than the last. And then silence. True silence. Not the silence of obedience, not the silence beaten into him since birth, but the silence of absence. The silence of voices erased. The big house, once filled with laughter, now lay heavy with death. He remained standing, his body rigid, his heart thundering so loud it seemed to echo through the empty hall. He had thought vengeance would set him free. He had thought silence would taste sweet. But now, standing among their corpses, he felt no freedom. He felt only emptiness, vast and hollow, as though the fire inside him had burned itself out in a single night. His chains had not fallen away. They remained, heavier than ever, bound not to his wrists but to his soul. The house seemed to groan around him, its beams creaking, its walls whispering. He felt as though the very walls were watching him, judging him, mourning him. The chandeliers flickered once, and for an instant the shadows stretched across the hall like reaching hands. He closed his eyes, but the silence did not leave. It pressed closer, smothering him, until he wished the lash would fall again, just to break it. He opened his eyes to the sight of the master's cane lying at his feet. Slowly he bent and picked it up. The wood felt heavy in his hand, still warm from the man's grasp. He held it for a long moment, staring at the lifeless body sprawled across the marble. Then, with a suddenness that startled even himself, he hurled the cane into the fire. The flames swallowed it greedily, sparks leaping high, but the act gave him no peace. Nothing did. He turned away from the hall at last, leaving behind the feast of ruin. The children's sobs followed him down the corridor, echoing through the empty house. Their cries haunted him, sharper than the silence, louder than the fire. He walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, his shadow stretching long upon the wall. The house was poisoned. The masters were gone. Yet the chains remained. And as he moved deeper into the silence, the truth settled upon him like ash. Vengeance does not heal. Vengeance only replaces one silence with another. By dawn, the big house stood hollow against the gray New York sky. The snow outside had deepened in the night, swallowing footsteps, muffling the world in a blanket of white. Smoke no longer curled from the chimneys. The windows, once blazing with candlelight, were dark now, black squares staring blindly into the cold morning. What had been a fortress of wealth only hours before now looked like a corpse, a carcass dressed in velvet, empty and cold. Word spread quickly through the city. Servants fleeing into the streets carried whispers of horror, of masters struck down in the middle of a feast, of children left wailing in the night. By sunrise, the whispers had reached the markets, the docks, the taverns where sailors drank away their wages. Men who had envied the family's fortune spoke the tale with awe, while others crossed themselves and muttered of curses. Women shook their heads and told their children not to speak too loud. The big house had fallen and no one knew how. Some said sickness had crept in, punishment for sins too great to ignore. Others swore it was poison, though none could prove it. Rumors bloomed like frost on glass, that a servant had slipped powder into the wine, that the house had been cursed by those sold and forgotten, that the very walls had turned against their masters. No one spoke the young man's name, for most had never known it, but his shadow threaded through every telling. A slave, silent and invisible, had become the center of a legend. Inside the house, he lingered in the silence. The bodies lay where they had fallen, the table still set for a feast that had become a funeral. The fire had burned low, leaving only blackened wood and curling ash. He walked among them, his bare feet soundless against the marble, his face unreadable. He felt neither triumph nor grief, only a strange kind of stillness, as though he had become part of the silence itself. The children were gone by then. Neighbors had come at first light, hearing their cries and carried them away. Their sobs had echoed down the corridors, fading into the cold air, leaving the house emptier than ever. He had not stopped them. He had watched as they were taken, their small faces pale with fear, their eyes darting back toward him as though they knew, somehow knew, that he was the shadow behind the night. He had met their gaze and said nothing. Silence was all he had left. What would become of him he did not know. Some say he slipped away into the streets, vanishing into the city's veins like smoke, never to be seen again. Some claim he was caught, dragged into the night by men with torches, and buried without a marker. Others whisper he returned to the south, walking alone until the sea swallowed him. The truth is lost, buried beneath snow and ash, smothered by the silence he carried. But the story remained. In taverns, men spoke of the slave who poisoned the big house, their voices dropping low, their eyes darting as though the walls themselves might be listening. In kitchens, women whispered it over bread and broth, warning their children that cruelty always carries a price. The city itself seemed to remember. The house stood empty for years, its windows shattered by storms, its walls sagging with rot. Children dared each other to run past its gates at night, swearing they heard footsteps inside, swearing they saw shadows moving in the windows though no one lived there. They said the house was cursed. They said the walls groaned with the voices of the dying, that the chandeliers swayed when no wind stirred. They said that if you stood at the gates in winter, when the snow was falling heavy and the air was still, you could hear the sound of a man breathing in the silence, waiting, always waiting. The story twisted with time as all stories do. Some told it as a tale of justice, of vengeance long overdue. Others told it as a warning, proof of the danger lurking in silence, in shadows, in those treated as less than human. But all agreed on one thing. The house had been poisoned, and it was a slave who had done it. The young man's name was never carved into stone, never written in records. History swallowed him whole as it swallows so many. But the story, the legend, lived on. It passed from mouth to mouth, carried across generations like a scar that never fades. And in that legend, he was no longer invisible. They remembered him not as a boy polishing silver, not as a shadow moving through marble halls, not as the silence beaten into obedience. They remembered him as the ember that finally burned, the silence that finally struck, the hand that turned a feast into a grave. The big house was abandoned, its name erased from polite speech, its ruins standing as a warning to all who passed. The city grew around it, new walls rising, new streets swallowing the old. But beneath it all, in the bones of the earth, the silence remained. A silence filled not with submission, but with memory. And so the tale endures. A story not of victory, but of sorrow. A story not of freedom, but of reckoning. They call it the story of the slave who poisoned the big house in New York, 1835. And some say, when the winter nights are long, when the snow falls thick and the city is hushed, his silence still lingers in the air, a whisper carried on the wind, not of joy, not of triumph, but of ash.